Welcome, friends. Whether you're out on a walk, running errands, or relaxing at home, it's wonderful to connect with you. Yes, today is Anthony Silard. Anthony is a professor of leadership and organizational psychology and the author of Love and Suffering. Break the emotional chains that prevent you from experiencing love. Now, that book was released this past April, a year ago in 2025. Anthony is an internationally recognized authority in the fields of relationships, leadership, emotional intelligence, relational healing, and personal transformation. Dr. Szilard, welcome to Phoenix and Flame.
Thank you, Dana. Love your show, and I appreciate you inviting me on.
This is going to be a good one. Now, you like to focus on things such as loneliness, resentment, depression, anxiety. I mean, these are large issues. Being a psychotherapist myself, I see a lot of patients. I've had a private practice for 18 years. And so I know these are huge issues. But I'm kind of wondering, how did this all start for you? Because clearly we have a lot of stuff we can dig into, and we will, but I really like to get to know my guests. And how did you get interested in these things? Kind of explain about, what your education level is and why you chose that.
This is a really good question, Dana. Yes, some people ask me like, "Hey, why don't you focus on positive emotions? Why don't you focus on like happiness and joy and enthusiasm?" And those interest me as well. I think probably where this comes from is there's a saying we teach what we most need to learn, and I think I had some traumatic experiences when I was very young, and I think brought me a little closer than I would have liked to loneliness, and that led to just my intrigue with it, to why people become lonely, what we can do about it, or especially given just I wasn't anticipating this sort of astronomical increase in loneliness that we've had these past 2 decades really. So I think that, and then also, it wasn't that I was looking to do any kind of research on depression or anxiety. It's more that as I got into loneliness, as I got into relationships and trying to understand what creates what I call CMSRs, compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationships, I started realizing that right now a lot of people are not experiencing those, and they're experiencing a tremendous amount of loneliness, depression, anxiety, and that really was where the intrigue came from. So before I did my doctorate at ESA Business School in Barcelona, focusing on emotion and leadership, and really the emphasis on loneliness. I'm now with Sarah Wright, New Zealand. She and I are the two researchers that sort of publish the most in this area around loneliness in organizations, and where that really came from was just seeing what's happening in the world now, seeing how really ever since Steve Jobs unveiled the first iPhone at the Macworld convention in his black turtleneck in San Francisco in 2007, and then the release of the first Android phone a year later, we're just seeing this exponential increase in loneliness and depression and anxiety. For the first time in U.S. history, we now have instead of it being the rare exception that a college student has a mental breakdown and sees a mental health counselor at some point in their 4 years. Now it's actually the norm, with over 50% seeking mental health counseling during their 4 years. And yeah, this has just been a real cause for pause for me, and real questioning. And I think because of the suffering I experienced myself, especially when I was young, it just became a sort of natural outgrowth for me to become passionate about why we become lonely and what we can do about it.
Loneliness is a huge deal, and I love the way that you were able to create something like you said earlier. We usually create what we need. um, in the
Mhm.
world, and I'm no different. That's they call me the queen of boundaries, and there's a very good reason for that. I've got the story behind that as well, and so I think that makes us very relatable because the research is fantastic and it's necessary and needed, and also the human component. Like, why would someone want to hear what you have to say? What with everyone out there talking about loneliness or depression or anxiety, you wrote a book, and so I'm wondering with you, especially let's just focus on loneliness for a moment because these
Mhm.
are big, broad strokes, and I'm thinking about people that are listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube that are feeling one of these things. And if we just hover over loneliness, if they're feeling exceptionally lonely and their life is they're suffering because of this, what is it that you want them to know? What do you want to say to them right now? They're listening and they're suffering. What do you want to say?
Well, I would say if you're suffering from loneliness, first of all, know that you're not alone. It's increasingly common. And I think a lot of this has to do with that we're on our screens so often. We're so often typing into our phones instead of talking in person. I remember when I did my doctorate, I became good friends with this Scottish engineer who was doing his 2-year MBA. He said in his 2-year MBA in Barcelona, he did not have a phone call with another student even once. Everything was textual, right? Through WhatsApp and texting and so forth, instant messaging. And for these reasons, loneliness is just skyrocketing. So first thing I would say to you is to in knowing that you're not alone, just consider in the United States alone, a Cigna study came out January 2018 that found that 4 to 3% of adult Americans were lonely based on the UCLA loneliness scale. Well, 2 years later, in January 2020, that percentage had leaped to 61%. And this is before the pandemic. So over
Wow.
3 in 5 adult Americans lonely. In the UK, former Prime Minister Theresa May hired a minister for loneliness. This was on the heels of a study that found that 8 million British people were lonely, and I'm not making this up, British children spend less time outside than prison inmates. So this is a global phenomenon. Yes, British children spend less time outside than prison inmates. You heard that correctly. In Japan, well, I don't know about you, Dana, but one group of citizens in our global economy that I really don't see as particularly dangerous are Japanese senior citizens, 75 and over. Well, they've actually been incarcerated at 4 times the rate of 15 years ago. So their rate of incarceration has quadrupled, and a lot of people be like, "What? Like, how could that happen?" Well, it's happening because they're going to the corner store and taking a small bag of rice or something, a pack of gum or something, and so that they can get arrested and go to jail. Because at least in prison there are people to talk to. At least in prison there's a community. At least in prison, you feel detected, acknowledged, and there was this sign that this 87-year-old Japanese man put on a bus stop in Japan, and it went viral. It said, "I'm 87. I don't have a family. Would some family take me?" And no one responded, and he passed away a couple months later. So okay, so loneliness is really, it's not something you want in your life. I mean, the physical consequences are you die younger, not you specifically, but on average, people die younger. The A recent meta-analysis found that the effects of being lonely are similar to smoking 15 cigarettes a day on your health. If you cut yourself, the wound takes longer to heal if you're lonely than if you're not, right? Now,
That is
psychological,
fascinating.
yeah, and then there are the psychological effects: lower self-esteem, being less able to cooperate with others, more burnout, and so forth. So, what all this is to say, if you're lonely, what do you do? Now, let me distinguish between loneliness and solitude. So, loneliness, the way I define it, loneliness is a negative, distressing emotion associated with being alone. Solitude is a positive, strengthening, solitude is a positive, strengthening emotion associated with being alone. So just as one person's trash is another person's treasure, being alone for some people is their trash, for other people it's their treasure. Now you want to move it toward being your treasure. So what I recommend if you're feeling lonely is to take an inner detour. Don't just go out and spend more time with people right away, because actually some of the loneliest people are in a crowd. Loneliness is not about being with or without others. It's not about being alone, it's about feeling alone. And you can feel alone in a group even more so than where you're actually physically alone. Especially if you're not like values congruent with the people in that group. So I think if you take some time out and think about how are you showing up in relationships? And that's really what my new book, Love and Suffering, is all about. Is about how do we show up in relationships? How can we make our relationships more meaningful? Create again what I call these CMSRs, compassionate, meaningful, sustainable relationships, where we feel connected with others, we feel our relationships are meaningful, and our relationships endure.
As I'm listening to you describe the relationship characteristics, and I'm thinking about people that I know, and I'm also thinking about generational differences because I'm thinking about Gen X experiences versus millennial experiences versus Gen Z. Um, a lot of the younger Gen Z crowd, I've heard a lot from them that they're struggling trying to find people, trying to find a partner, that is aligned with their values and with all the things that's on social media and all of the influence there, it's a big deal. I was kind of wondering as you were talking if you had run into differences with love connection and, the loneliness and the ability to connect as it goes through different generational experiences.
Excellent question, Dana. Yeah, definitely. I mean, because the main one of the main differences is that our younger generation. Well, first of all, we have to understand that when we think about loneliness, we often think about people like that 87-year-old leaving that sign out of desperation on the bus stop. We think about older people's being the loneliest, right? So you think about it. Let's say you're in your 60s, 70s, 80s. I'm 58, so I'm almost there. All right. Let's say you're in your 60s, 70s, 80s, and your friends are dying. Maybe you've retired and you're not meeting people through the workplace, which has increasingly become a place for socialization, and so you're feeling lonely. So traditionally, the oldest people have always been the loneliest. But the Cigna study had a really chilling finding, which is that the loneliest people today are not the oldest; they're the youngest.
Mm.
Right? So it's really the Gen Z, the millennial, the youngest generation, where because they're essentially growing up without really what I would call like an emotion elevator in their parents. Like parents, as far as I'm concerned, the role of parents is to be an emotion elevator. You literally want to elevate your children to not be at the base level of emotions where you're just like whatever you feel, you're acting it out. In other words, no emotion regulation. You want to help your children get into that elevator and go up to a more elevated state where they can think about their emotions. They can think about what they're experiencing and regulate that experience so that they don't just right away, for example, we have two kids, they're 12 and 9 years old. And, you have to have these conversations with your kids all the time. Like, for example, hey, I know you weren't happy when your best friend got a bigger piece of cake than you did at the birthday party. But if you make a big deal out of that and throw a tantrum and let everybody know that it wasn't fair, that what's your best friend going to think? She's going to think, well, you don't really care so much about me, do you? It's just for you about what you're going to get. And so regulating that disappointment, that frustration that you didn't get the bigger piece of cake, so Jenny Radesky, she's a professor in Massachusetts, and she wrote the screen use guidelines for the American Academy of Pediatrics. I interviewed her for my previous book called Screened In: The Art of Living Free in the Digital Age, which is all about how our screens are affecting us in our relationships. So when I interviewed her, she shared with me what she calls the conversational duet, which I think is just brilliant. Conversational duet is this continual back and forth call and response between a child and its primary caretaker, where they're the child is not understanding things, and the primary and secondary caretaker too. So mother and father, and sometimes it's the other order. They're really helping their child to understand what they're experiencing, so they can be that emotion elevator, and that child can have like a more elevated response to the events happening in her or his daily life. And so a lot of young people, their parents have essentially like abdicated that responsibility to carry out their part in the conversational duet, to be the emotion elevator. As a result, a lot of children today, they didn't grow up with that. They grow up with like, oh, you're feeling some difficult emotions. Well, here, why don't you play with your iPad? Why don't you go get on the phone for a while? And so they're outsourcing emotion regulation to the electronic babysitter, which is not a good which is not a good which is not a good mentor for children, of course. And so we're seeing this. We're seeing there are a lot of studies, for example, that have found that children from lower income families where the parents are working two or three jobs, those children are often having the most difficulty in terms of grades, making friends, even and a whole host of other dysfunctional behaviors, because they're not having those dinners at home with their parents as often. They're not spending as much time with their parents, and not getting that emotion elevator that they need. And so this is what's happening with them. Not just the irony is it's not just low income kids at all. It's, I mean, even middle and high income people have just become increasingly busy. Not just men, but also women who, like women have gone to the workplace en masse. I mean, we have essentially, for the first time in US history, over 50% of managers are women now. And women have gone to the workplace, justifiably so they wouldn't have to feel under the thrall of often very insensitive men. But men have not, while women have moved to the workplace, men have not moved to the home. They haven't picked up that caretaking. So the outcome is that no one's doing the caretaking. Like essentially, children are suffering, young people are suffering. And so if you're experiencing loneliness and you're in a younger generation, know that you're not alone. And I think what I could recommend is, in terms of, okay, how can you find that right person? Again, for one, the inner detour, which I already shared a bit about. Number two would be, like, I think about, for example, James, a young guy who came to see me. I do a lot of leadership and executive and life coaching, and he came to see me, and he had slept with a few women. He felt really guilty about it. He's having trouble meeting that right person, and what I found with James, the same thing I find when I am coaching CEOs, senior leaders of Fortune 500 companies like Toyota, Apple, Google, Boeing. Whenever I'm coaching leaders or coaching individuals, it's always this. It's always comes down to the same thing. The challenges the person is having is because there's someone in their life that they haven't forgiven. And a lot of young people today are resentful toward their parents for being so inaccessible for the reasons I just shared. And in James's case, there was a lot of that. There was feelings like his mother wasn't really there for him. She was so busy all the time. He felt all of this resentment. And resentment, if you look at the etymology of resentment, it comes from re, which is again, and sentire, to feel. Resentment is to feel anger again and again and again until you become paralyzed. This is what happened to James. Well, he came to see me. I helped him work on his resentment, some of the strategies which I share in Love and Suffering, because Love and Suffering, my new book, has got four plateaus on this sort of love progression model, I call it, to move toward love. So you've got acceptance, forgiveness, gratitude, and love. Each of those plateaus has an obstacle that has to be overcome. So you overcome suffering to reach acceptance, you overcome resentment to reach forgiveness, you overcome judgment to reach gratitude, you overcome what I call incarceration to reach a state of love. And this is
Okay.
based on a lot of stories, like a lot of case studies like James's and others that I've put them all together. as well as some of the latest psychological studies on these different states. And and so with James, and this is what I would recommend to your listeners.
Anthony, Anthony.
Yeah, I'm saying, is that too long?
No, that's fantastic. It's just it's like a wow, this is I'm thinking of comments that I wanna ask and
Yeah, please
questions
go
to
ahead.
ask.
Sorry.
So, because you're giving such amazing, wonderful information, and I'm imagining if I was a listener, it's just like, "Woohoo! Let's just" I wanna, like, slow it down just a little bit so we
Sure.
can absorb a
You
little bit
got it.
more about
You
what you're
got it.
saying. You have been doing this so long, and you have collected so much fantastic stuff. I wanna make sure we appreciate it like we should. Um, so I had a question. When you think about people that are lonely, and I'm rewinding back to the emotional elevator, okay?
Okay.
And so, first of all, you made a comment about someone like a child that has emotions and is sent to like a tech something, a screen to look at. And
Mhm.
so sometimes also I see people that just they're not looking at anything. They're saying, "Well, whatever you feel, you can just feel." They're not teaching them any kind of coping strategies of what to do. "Oh, I see you're angry." So they're allowed to just scream and holler and throw things around with no that emotional elevator that you were mentioning, there was no guidance for that to bring them up. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on someone who maybe was raised with a parent who kind of helped them with that emotional elevator. Then they're going out and they're trying to form relationships with people. And what I'm wondering is are your thoughts about the role of self absorption? Because I see people having a hard time connecting with others because it's like everyone or the vast majority of people seem to be incredibly focused on themselves where they can't it kind of reminds me in a way years ago I was in college in a public speaking class and they were talking about a duologue, a dialogue versus a duologue. And people that are just talking at one another, they're just waiting for the other person's mouth to stop moving so they can just start saying whatever they want to say. They're not processing what the other person is saying at all. I happen to see that a lot out in the world where people aren't really connecting. And I was really curious about your experience with that and what your thoughts are on this pandemic that of just self-absorption of and how that's creating the loneliness and the and impacting and obstructing connectiveness with people.
Well, you're right on target with that, Dana. There's there's actually been a number of studies on how empathy is declining, especially in the younger generation. There's Jean Twenge's work, and there's others where they found that both cognitive empathy, which is also called perspective taking, putting yourself psychologically in someone else's shoes. That's what we traditionally think of as empathy, and affective empathy. Affective empathy is also called empathic concern. It's feeling what others feel. We're seeing a 40% decline in both of those, really over the last couple decades. And in terms of self-absorption, I mean, I think it's interesting because yes, I do see an increase in self-absorption, but we also have to be aware that Dale Miller at Stanford did some research on what's called the norm of self-interest. This idea that people are self-interested, and there's actually been a number of studies that have shown that actually, if you give, for example, you give someone $20 and you say, "Here, go and buy something for yourself." And you have a whole group of people you're doing that with, and then you have another group where you're giving them $20 and you're saying, "Hey, go buy something for someone else with this money." And then at the end of the day, you check, like, they do kind of a neurological study with some, hook up some cords up to people's mind, and they tape them on people's minds to understand what's going on in their brains. The executive functioning center, the PFC, prefrontal cortex, where we can see when people are experiencing more of a dopamine surge. There's more of this neurohormone coursing through their blood, and you see it in this sort of dopamine center in their brains. Well, they actually experience more of a dopamine rush when they buy something for someone else than when they buy something for themselves. So what a lot of people don't realize is, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Dana, that we're seeing this huge increase in self-absorption. But at the same time, a lot of it is coming from just because we're on our screens so often that we are kind of, when you look at these studies of the decline of empathy, a lot of it's attributed to that we're so much time on social media, so much time on our phones, that we start to just see other people as less interested in us. So why should we be interested in them? Like if you look, for example, when you send when you send an email or a text message, more often than not, this is Chris Byron's research at Georgia State. When someone receives that email or text message, if you intend it to be emotionally positive, it's received as being emotionally neutral. Whereas if you send it intending it to be emotionally neutral, it's usually received as being emotionally negative. So there's sort of this negative downward pull and slant over our the emotional part of our relationships, which I think leads to people becoming more self-absorbed.
Well, and I had another question for you about you had mentioned forgiveness, and I appreciate the effort that you put into looking at that and the role that it plays in our relationships. And as someone who's focused a lot on boundaries throughout the years, it's interesting the difference between forgiveness and permission, because it's one thing if someone did something in the past. If you had an interaction, you had a relationship with someone and they did something in the past, and then there can be some forgiveness of that. It's not happening today. And then we can you mentioned the word resentment and what that, the origin of that was, and we can work past that, and it's wonderful you're doing work with people to help them let go of some experience they had possibly as a child that's not continuing. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on these similar relationships, whereas someone who they might have done XYZ in the past and they are still doing these things. They are not wanting to turn away from particularly dysfunctional patterns, and yet they want forgiveness, but it isn't really forgiveness that they want. They want permission to keep doing this dysfunctional thing. So, what are your thoughts on the role of forgiveness when you're dealing with someone like I'm describing?
Mhm. Well, it's interesting. I think in many ways, Love and Suffering is a very countercultural book because I look at these kind of these myths that we've kind of been force fed all of our lives around forgiveness, around all the other themes that I write about, and why we shouldn't accept those. So, for example, forgiveness, we're taught, forgive and forget. Well, let me ask you this: if you're walking at night and you fall into a ditch, I don't know about you, but I kind of like to remember the location of the ditch for when I'm walking in the future. Right.
Yes.
So forgive and forget is actually a pretty horrible idea. I think much more useful is forgive and remember, but remember lightly. So don't put like 100 post-its all around your room reminding you of what happened. Don't sort of develop a poem about it that you recite to yourself every Saturday night. But it's kind of like each person is like a file that you put into a file cabinet. Each person, they have all of the kind of nuances of who they are that you want to know so that you can know how to deal with them in the future. So I really like, Dana, the way you distinguish between forgiveness and permission. That's kind of from the purview of the perpetrator, right? So they want forgiveness and then they want permission to continue what they're doing. From the purview of the victim of whatever as whatever has transpired that requires forgiveness, what I do is distinguish between forgiveness and trust. So forgiveness and trust is similar to permission, but from the other side. So forgiveness is necessary for personal development because if you like we said, if you don't forgive someone, you become stuck, you're paralyzed with that resentment's what you feel while the other person's out dancing, right? So you're there, you're like kind of cowering in your room with seething with all of this anger that multiplies over time, and that's resentment. Whereas the other person, just they're not even thinking about it. So resentment's not a good idea. We need to go to forgiveness just so we can become unstuck, so we can move forward in our lives. So forgiveness is necessary for personal development. What I write in Love and Suffering, though, is that trust is necessary for relationship development. That's something different. In other words, if you want to continue the relationship with another person, then that's where trust comes in. And trust comes from essentially accountability and credibility. Like, okay, they're accountable. I know they say they're not going to do this again. I believe that that's actually the case. Why? Because of their credibility, based on some of the soul searching they've done after what happened, and based on what they've been telling me. I really believe that they're not going to perpetrate this action, whatever it was, another time. Now, credibility and accountability come together to form predictability, which is really the foundation of trust. I predict that they are going to be able to change their ways. So that's the thing. You can forgive someone, but it doesn't mean that you're going to trust them, that you want to have a continued relationship with them.
I love that. That's wonderful. I love the components that you're bringing into play. They're very applicable and understandable and practical. Uh, our time is about over, but I wanted to make sure that our listeners and our viewers know exactly where to go to get more access to you. And I have a website in correct me if I'm wrong, but the website that I have is the art of living tree or livingfree.org.
Yes.
Theartoflivingfree.org.
Yeah, if your listeners, you guys out there, men and women, boys and girls, if you go to theartoflivingfree.org and then slash free happiness and friendship books, then, well, first of all, I mean, I'd love it if you buy Love and Suffering. It's all the proceeds of the book go to nonprofit education programs in Africa and Latin America. But, times are difficult now. So whether you buy Love and Suffering or not, I would like to offer you two free books. They are The Myth of Happiness, How Your Definition of Happiness Creates Your Unhappiness, and The Myth of Friendship, How Your Misunderstandings About Friendship Keep You Lonely. A lot of the themes we talked about here today. And you just go to theartoflivingfree.org slash free happiness and friendship books. Put in your email, you get a confirmation email. Once you confirm it in your inbox, you get the download links. And yeah, I hope you'll enjoy them.
Those books sound fabulous, and, when it starts the myth of, I love anything that starts that because that says you're gonna just jump right in there and you're gonna be real with something, and you're gonna just because that's how we live. We live in the real world, not in some kinda abstraction, but in the real world, and so anytime something starts with the myth of, I'm like, "Okay, I'm on board. They're really gonna be honest about this." So that sounds exciting. Anthony, thank you so much for spending your time and your wisdom and your energy with me this morning on Phoenix and Flame. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you, Dana. You've been a wonderful host, and I really appreciate you for having me on your show.
Now, listeners and viewers, I know that you have heard multiple things today from Dr. Anthony Silard that's like, oh my gosh, I know a best friend, I know a coworker, I know a family member that needs to know what he said. Take this episode, copy and paste it, send it in text, send it in email, post it on your favorite social media site so we can grow our Phoenix and Flame community and let people know you are not alone. I hope your day is going great. I hope the rest of your day is fantastic. I'm Dana on Phoenix and Flame.